One of the little things I love in The Lord of the Rings is something that Gloin the Dwarf says. And yes, I did say Gloin, and I did mean something he says in The Lord of the Rings, and not in The Hobbit, which is where I would say he is most noted as being in. Because there is a Gloin in The Lord of the Rings, and he is, as Frodo says to him upon their meeting at Rivendell, "Am I right in guessing you are the Gloin? One of the 12 companions of the great Thorin Oakenshield?" "Quite right," is the answer, because he is. And his adventure as part of Thorin and Company is chronicled, of course, not in The Lord of the Rings, but in The Hobbit. And as far as that book goes, and the things that Gloin says over there, he starts off as rather talkative, having two fairly decent chunks of dialogue right in the first chapter, An Unexpected Party. In one of them, he helpfully offers up this distinction between job titles. Helpful possibly to Bilbo Baggins, who the dwarves have been told is one or the other, although Bilbo is quite lost. "You can say expert treasure hunter instead of burglar if you like. Some of them do. It's all the same to us." What's not all the same is how Bilbo looks and behaves, and what the dwarves think of this expert treasure hunter or burglar or whatever he is. His behavior draws, from Gloin at any rate, a humph, or some snort more or less like that. He then provides a more detailed assessment. "Will he do you think? It is all very well for Gandalf to talk about this hobbit being fierce, but one shriek like that in a moment of excitement would be enough to wake the dragon and all his relatives, and kill the lot of us. I think it sounded more like fright than excitement. In fact, if it had not been for the sign on the door, I should have been sure we had come to the wrong house. As soon as I clapped eyes on the little fellow bobbing and puffing on the mat, I had my doubts." And then Gloin says one of the more famous lines in the whole book. "He looks more like a grocer than a burglar." Unfortunately, Gloin says a little too much, and it draws a bit of ire from Gandalf, who scowled so angrily at Gloin that the dwarf huddled back in his chair. Gandalf's scowl there seems to have done the trick, better even than Gandalf may have supposed, because from that point on, Gloin is not given very much to say at all throughout the rest of the book. He becomes relegated to the mob of dwarves, which I would say necessity requires Tolkien to treat as just that, the author referring to the collective more than the individual as the story goes on, using phrases such as they and the others and Thorin and Company and the dwarves. Let's face it, it's pretty hard to give 13 different dwarves their own time in the spotlight, especially in a book called The Hobbit. We do at least learn a little about Gloin, that being that he and Owen are very good at making fires, although they do lose their tinderboxes at one point, which makes starting a fire even harder than it was when they were trying to do so with tinderboxes in the wind and rain very early in their adventure. Of course, I do find it slightly ironic that Gloin and Owen, the fire makers, are among those cited as being waterlogged when drawn from the barrels in their escape from the Elven King's halls. But if he doesn't get much to say throughout the rest of The Hobbit, he more than makes up for it in The Lord of the Rings, even though he appears in just 2 scenes. Both of them take place in Rivendell, and the fact that he is even here at all is related to the events in The Hobbit, as pretty much everything else that happens in the trilogy is. Specifically, he is here in Rivendell to warn Bilbo of a dangerous situation going on back at the Lonely Mountain, which he does not speak of at the outset, when we and Frodo meet him at the feast celebrating Frodo's recovery. "But I'm equally curious," Frodo added after learning that this is the Gloin, "to learn what brings so important a dwarf so far from the Lonely Mountain." Gloin looked at him. "If you have not heard, I think we will not speak yet of that either. Master Elrond will summon us all ere long, I believe, and then we shall all hear many things. But there is much else that may be told." From there, Gloin regales Frodo with a long account of the doings of the Dwarf Kingdom, and of the works of his people, telling Frodo about their great labors in Dale and under the mountain. "We have done well," he said. Well, indeed, as Dain, who is still king under the mountain, is described as old, venerable, and fabulously rich. Alas, what Gloin has to say at the Council of Elrond the next day is anything but fabulous. The dwarf happens to be the first to speak at the council, and we are told that, amid the splendor of their works of hand, the hearts of the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain were troubled. He speaks of how the desire to retake Moria was strong within many, and Balin resolved to go, taking Ori and Owen and many of the dwarf folk with him. "That was nigh on 30 years ago. For a while we had news, and it seemed good. Messages reported that Moria had been entered, and a great work begun there. Then there was silence, and no word has ever come from Moria since." But that's not the worst of it. About a year ago, a messenger from Mordor came, saying that the Lord Sauron the Great wished for friendship with the dwarves. Rings he would give for it, such as he gave of old. But the messenger also wanted to know about hobbits, for Sauron knows that one of these was known to you on a time. This hobbit is called a thief, and that Sauron wants from him a little ring, the least of rings, that he once stole. It is but a trifle that Sauron fancies, and an earnest of your good will. Find only news of the thief, whether he still lives and where, and you shall have great reward and lasting friendship from the Lord. Refuse, and things will not seem so well. Do you refuse?" At that his breath came like the hiss of snakes, and all who stood by shuddered. "Twice the messenger has returned, and has gone unanswered. The third and last time, so he says, is soon to come, before the ending of the year. And so I have been sent at last by Dain to warn Bilbo that he is sought by the enemy, and to learn, if may be, why he desires this ring, this least of all rings. Also, we crave the advice of Elrond, for the shadow grows and draws nearer." Ominous, to say the least. But none of that is the little moment that I'm referring to. That comes later. Because Gloin's story is just the beginning of all that is spoken and debated in the council. Not all of which, we are told, need be told. But certainly plenty does. After Gloin's story, Elrond tells the history of Sauron and the Rings of Power, which is a long tale, full of deeds great and terrible. And, despite Elrond speaking briefly, the sun rode up the sky, and the morning was passing ere he ceased. He goes into a lot of history, telling of the elven smiths of Eregion and their friendship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, of the forging of the Rings of Power, of Celebrimbor alone forging in secret the 3 rings for the elves, and of Sauron also operating in secret and alone, forging the One Ring to rule them all. Elrond also speaks of Númenor and the last alliance of elves and men who threw down Sauron, and Isildur, who cut the ring from Sauron's finger. And Elrond tells about how he was there, on the slopes of Mount Doom, where he urged Isildur to throw the ring into the fire, and Isildur's saying no. And also how the ring betrayed Isildur at the Gladden Fields. On and on he speaks of the 3,000 years from that point to this, and the decline of the power and majesty of the kingdom of Gondor. Boromir then takes over, telling of Gondor's efforts to hold firm against the power of Mordor, which has been rising even as Gondor's fades. We are then treated to an account of Bilbo's adventure with Gollum, where they told their riddles in the dark, but especially of Bilbo finding the ring and escaping with it. Then Frodo tells of his adventures getting here to Rivendell while being pursued by the Black Riders. And finally, we get Gandalf's story and his ultimate discovery that this truly is the One Ring that was lost so long ago to the diminishment of Sauron's powers. And I feel a need to quote Pippin here from much earlier in the book when he says, "It's coming out in a minute," because I'm finally getting to it. That moment that I started with, that thing that Gloin says. Because the next stop in all of this tale telling is the story of Gollum and what happened to him. He is great in mischief, Boromir says, and all are glad to know that he is in prison being held by the elves of Mirkwood. But wait! No, he's not! Legolas, the son of King Thranduil, is here to tell them all that Gollum has escaped. That is ill news indeed, says Aragorn. Legolas understands, and he elaborates, as they all want to know what happened. It was not through lack of watchfulness, said Legolas, but perhaps over-kindliness. We guarded this creature day and night, at Gandalf's bidding, much though we wearied of the task. But Gandalf bade us hope still for his cure, and we had not the heart to keep him ever in the dungeons under the earth, where he would fall back into his old black thoughts. You were less tender to me, said Gloin with a flash of his eyes, as old memories were stirred of his imprisonment in the deep places of the Elven King's halls. And there it is, that moment, that thing that I love. Because Gloin has sat through this entire council so far, all morning and into the early afternoon, listening to everything that I've just recapped, details of what is the most important moment in all of their lives, elves included. This is the calamity of the age. It is history in the making. A great darkness is descending, which could consume everyone and everything, and bring ruination to all of Middle-earth. Gloin himself declares that part of the reason he is even here in Rivendell is to seek the advice of Elrond, for the shadow grows and draws nearer. And yet, in the face of all that, and in front of all these great and powerful elves and men, and one wizard and two hobbits, one of which is his old friend Bilbo, who he refers to as the Renowned, he feels the need to be as stubborn as the Silmarillion tells us dwarves are. Stone-hard and stubborn, to be specific. Or, as Legolas says later as they head into Lothlorien, a plague on dwarves and their stiff necks. Gloin takes this moment, of all moments, to bring up this old, awful memory of his imprisonment at the hands of the Elven King of Mirkwood, Thranduil. And what was that? Well, we have to go back to the Hobbit for that, but Thorin and company have traveled long and far, but are currently lost in Mirkwood, lost and starving. They see, and are drawn to, the appearance of elves enjoying a feast in the woods. But these elves disappear when the dwarves come blundering up to them. After this happens more than once, the dwarves become lost to Bilbo, who finds them later captured by giant spiders. Bilbo fights and wins their freedom. From the spiders' webs, at least. Not from the elves, though, who have already taken Thorin and now capture the rest of them. Bilbo is spared thanks to his magic ring and being invisible, but he must remain hidden within the Elven King's halls while the dwarves languish in their cells. After a week or two, Bilbo finds everyone, and then, after a bit, figures out a way to escape, by barrel, which is when we learn of Gloin and a few others being waterlogged when they finally come out. This is the imprisonment that Gloin is talking about, saying, "You were less tender to me," as compared to how the elves have been treating Gollum. And he's not wrong, since he and the others are kept in cells in different parts of the palace, while Gollum at least gets to come outside at times. That aside, though, Gandalf, surely giving a scowl similar to the one he gave Gloin way back in Bag End during the unexpected party, has something to say about Gloin's comment. "Now come," said Gandalf, "pray do not interrupt, my good Gloin. That was a regrettable misunderstanding, long set right." And he is not wrong in that, since the elves and dwarves sorted things out in the Battle of Five Armies, joining forces with each other and the men of Dale to take on the orcs and wargs. Gandalf then adds, "If all the grievances that stand between elves and dwarves are to be brought up here, we may as well abandon this council." And I don't know as I have that much more time here than Gandalf did for all of those grievances, but I think they're worth a little bit of a visit. The Hobbit tells us, in ancient days, they, the elves, had had war with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure. It is only fair to say that the dwarves gave a different account, and said that they only took what was their due, for the elf king had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. All this was well known to every dwarf. The details of this are found in the Silmarillion, in the chapter of the Ruin of Doriath. But Hammond and Scull, in their volume The Lord of the Rings, A Reader's Companion, do it a bit more concisely. In later days, the dwarves lusted after the Silmaril in the Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, that had come into the possession of the Sindarin king Thingol of Doriath, whom they slew. And in the resulting war of vengeance, many elves and dwarves were slain, and it has not been forgotten. And while that was very real, and the rawness of it is right not to be forgotten by either race, it's also important to remember that Elrond began his telling of things at the council with the story of the friendship between the elves of Eregion and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm in the Second Age. The Silmarillion takes place in the First Age. So it's clearly possible for both sides to overcome those old grievances. And yet, Gloin is ready to bring up his old grievance right now, when it's actually looking like everyone is getting along for a change, elves, dwarves, and men, just as they had back at the Battle of Five Armies, having been called hither to Rivendell, as Elrond says, "Called, I say, though I have not called you to me, strangers from distant lands. You have come and are here met, in this very nick of time, by chance as it may seem." And yet, dwarves and their stiff necks. I guess he does have a gripe. Thorin and company did nothing to the elves back then, except blunder into their feasts, because the dwarves were starving and desperate. Gollum has done quite a bit worse than that, and yet he gets to go outside and climb trees? But then again, the woodland elves are not wrong either, in both wanting to show this pathetic creature some kind of mercy, but also wearying of their task, since they have had Gollum in prison for about a year now. And timing is a key element here. As noted before, it's not clear exactly how long the dwarves were held. It takes Bilbo 1 or 2 weeks to find them all, and then an uncertain number of days before he can work out the barrel escape plan. All told, though, it was surely no more than a month. And this grievance that Gloin brings up took place back in Third Age 2941. The Council of Elrond takes place in Third Age 3018. So, he is griping about less than a month in jail 77 years ago? Now, Gloin is here at the Council of Elrond with his son Gimli. Gimli is 139 years old at this time, and so it's a pretty fair bet that he has heard this imprisonment story before. After all, the adventures of Thorin and company are of major importance to the dwarves, since their efforts allowed for the restoration of the dwarves' northern kingdom. And given that the dwarves have songs about the destruction of that kingdom by Smaug, it's almost certain that they would have songs about its restoration. The Hobbit itself notes things said in song about the Battle of Five Armies and Thorin's final repose. And so it makes sense that a song about their adventure would not only exist, but surely feature this capture by the elves somewhere in it, as would Bilbo's help in securing their rescue. After all, he is called the Renowned. So again, it's a good bet that Gimli knows this story very well. If Gloin is still bringing it up here after so long, he surely has brought it up in the intervening years, to his son and to others back at the Lonely Mountain, like the surviving members of Thorin and company, undoubtedly over a pint of ale or two. One could even suppose that Gimli heard about the story even on the way here to Rivendell. "So, son," I can see Gloin saying, "we are heading into elf country, so beware. Remember what happened to me." And I would like to picture Gimli cringing in his seat at the council as Gloin brings this up, possibly muttering to himself, "Dad, please, not again." But that's probably wishful thinking. Dwarves don't like elves, period. And after so long hearing the story of that imprisonment, he presumably would have come into Rivendell with an awareness of how awful elves can be. After all, once the Fellowship of the Ring is formed and makes its way south into the land of Hollin, we hear Gandalf saying, "Those were happier days, when there was still close friendship at times between folk of different race, even between dwarves and elves." "It was not the fault of the dwarves that the friendship waned," said Gimli. "I have not heard that it was the fault of the elves," said Legolas. Like we heard in The Hobbit of this mutual dislike, Gandalf sums that up by saying, "I have heard both." Later, Legolas sings the song of Nimrodel, but declares, "I cannot sing any more. That is but a part, for I have forgotten much. It is long and sad, for it tells how sorrow came upon Lothlorien, Lorien of the Blossom, when the dwarves awakened evil in the mountains." "But the dwarves did not make the evil," said Gimli. "I said not so. Yet evil came," answered Legolas sadly. So, the passive-aggressive behavior is mutual, and shows that Gimli, and Legolas too, are both harboring these age-old grudges. They wouldn't say what they say if they didn't. Because it's a curious thing. On the squabble goes, fueled by the history of their respective races, but also, I would say, by their respective fathers. Because it's important to remember that Gloin, Gimli's father, was held prisoner by Thranduil, who is Legolas's father. Think about that. Gimli's father was held prisoner by Legolas's father. Given that, I think it extremely unlikely that either of them would have gotten away scot-free of a childhood not hearing about this imprisonment. Legolas, of course, was maybe even there the whole time. Scowls aside, and annoyances, Gandalf presses both Gimli and Legolas at the doors of Durin to put this stuff behind them. "I beg you to, Legolas and Gimli, at least to be friends, and to help me. I need you both." It's still a hope that, despite the deep-seated grudge against the elves, it's as I was imagining, Gimli having grown tired of hearing about the specific old grievance of his father's. And maybe Legolas, too, has grown sick of hearing about it from his dad. And maybe that's what really bonded them on the journey. Because they do listen to Gandalf's words, not after Moria, but definitely after Lothlorien. As they get into the boats provided by Celeborn, we read, "The company was arranged in this way. Aragorn, Frodo, and Sam were in one boat, Boromir, Merry, and Pippin in another, and in the third were Legolas and Gimli, who had now become fast friends." One can suppose it's the influence of Galadriel which turns the tide. After all, when she asks Gimli what he will do with the gift he has asked her for, a single strand of her hair, he says, "It shall be set in imperishable crystal to be an heirloom of my house, and a pledge of goodwill between the mountain and the wood until the end of days." A pledge of goodwill between mountain and wood, that is, between dwarf and elf. This is a far cry from the Gimli who entered Lothlorien having drawn his axe from his belt on Haldir and the other elves who commanded him to wear a blindfold. And from Lothlorien, as the friendship between Gimli and Legolas grows, who knows what they discuss in an unrecorded fashion, about their peoples and histories, and about their fathers. And who can say that after the War of the Ring was over, that they didn't share a pint of ale or glass of wine with, oh, I don't know, Faramir, say. And together they all could discuss the finer points of fatherhood and what it can do to sons, whether elf, dwarf, or man. All conjecture, of course, but we do get the friendship. And we also get a sign from Gloin, back at the council, that he can put things aside. At least, and seemingly as usual, once he gets a good scowl or talking to from Gandalf. Because the full sequence in the text goes this way. "You were less tender to me said Gloin with a flash of his eyes, as old memories were stirred of his imprisonment in the deep places of the Elven King's halls. Now come, said Gandalf, pray do not interrupt my good Gloin. That was a regrettable misunderstanding, long set right. If all the grievances that stand between elves and dwarves are to be brought up here, we may as well abandon this council. Gloin rose and bowed, and Legolas continued. And while Legolas continues, I will conclude by saying that Gloin's comment is one of the little things I love in The Lord of the Rings. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.